Greetings, I'm your host, Jason Miles, and welcome to another episode of This is Revolution Podcast. For all the returning listeners and subscribers, thank you very much for coming back. To those new to the channel, thank you for taking a moment to check us out. If you dig what we're doing, please hit like and, of course, subscribe. It is a passive gesture that goes a very long way. Quick reminder before I bring the guest in, TIR is a listener-supported program. Without y'all, we couldn't do this. If you enjoy what we do here on TIR and have the means and feel so inclined, become a patron. For as little as $3 a month or $30 for the year, you can access our patron-only champagne rooms, which will be going in tonight with M. Toussaint. Oh, yeah. She's coming back just to join us for the champagne room. You can join us for movie nights, which I think I'm going to make June Ninja Movie Month. Oh! You can never have enough ninja movies. You get access to the TIR Discord, and you get the satisfaction of knowing that you help contribute to the insanity that is TIR. Also, we will be back on Saturday. We'll be discussing the phenomenon of black fatigue with the TIR crew, Professor Toure Reed, and Bertrand Cooper. If you didn't have black fatigue before Saturday, this lineup of colored folks will definitely have you ready to throw in a towel. Now, with all that out of the way, let's talk about liberation theology. Do we need to bring back liberation theology? And I'll start with a quote from the late liberation theologist James Cone. To understand what the cross means in America, we need to take a look at the lynching tree in the nation's history, that strange and bitter crop that Billie Holiday would not let us forget. The lynched black victim experienced the same fate as the crucified Christ and thus became the most potent symbol for understanding the true meaning of the salvation achieved through God on the cross. Nietzsche was right. Christianity is a religion of slaves. God became a slave in Jesus and thereby liberated slaves from being determined by their social condition. The real scandal of the gospel is this: humanity's salvation is revealed in the cross of the condemned criminal Jesus, and humanity's salvation is available only through our solidarity with the crucified people in our midst. Again, that's from James Cone, The Cross and the Lynching Tree. James Cone forces American Christians to confront the nation's brutal legacy of lynching and how it shapes the spiritual meaning of the cross. For Cone, the crucifixion is not just a theological abstraction, it is mirrored in the terror and spectacle of the lynching tree. In Jim Crow America, thousands of black people were sacrificed to uphold white supremacy, and Cone understood that their suffering bore a deep resemblance to that of Christ, tormented, abandoned, and executed to the applause of the crowd. We're not here today for a deep dive into Cone's theology, nor are we hosting a broad discourse on lynching. Instead, we'll take up a powerful question posed in a recent Counterpunch article by our guest. Why not a return to liberation theology? Last week in our conversation with Professor Roger Lancaster, we discussed how the Catholic Church spent the 1970s and 80s rooting out the voices of dissent who dared to connect faith with justice. The question now is the church or Christianity more broadly worse off without these prophetic voices? In his latest for Counterpunch titled Compact Smears Pope Francis, journalist and poet Arturo Desimone challenges the right populist framing of neoliberalism. In this worldview, immigrants rather than capital are blamed for economic ruin. As Desimone notes, this is a grotesque distortion. He writes, quote, "This worldview portrays immigrants as the harbingers of liquid modernity. Through often in rags, border crossers are possessed by the specters of capital. The immigrant, rather than the CEO, is targeted for being the importer of economic chaos," unquote. Meanwhile, corporate elites exploiting cheap migrant labor, are conveniently ignored. Pope Francis, by contrast, has pointed to what he calls the globalization of indifference, a world order that discards the poor and demonizes the displaced. If we want to rebuild a strong left coalition, one that includes the marginalized and not just the managerial class, perhaps we need to take theology seriously again, at least the kind rooted in solidarity with the oppressed. Please welcome returning guest, friend of show, author, journalist, poet, Arturo Desimone. How are you?
Very good. How are you? Thanks for that introduction.
You weren't ready for all the liberation theology we were going to throw at you?
Yes, of course. Well, you surprised me with a lot of James Cone, who, I mean, of course, I'm aware of him. He's, of course, a little less representative of liberation theology writ large. Well, yes and no. I mean, what he says about the crucified in our midst sounds very much like liberation theology, and it is. But he was Protestant, and he put racial questions at the very center of liberation theology, and he also talked about ontological blackness. And so I would suspect that you would be critical. I mean, because I've seen your conversations with the Reeds. I suspect you would be more suspicious of Cone.
I mean, I'm not like 7, and if somebody says something that I don't like, then everything they say sucks. I think that there's a place for people like James Cone.
Of course.
If there's, we want to talk about liberation theology from the Latin American sense, then of course there's not going to have the same racial questions, right? Because most of these people are Latin themselves, and they're in Latin America.
Yes. Well, I mean, it depends. I mean, they also explore racial questions. Absolutely. Leonardo both from Brazil definitely explores racial questions. And not all of the important liberation theologians were from Latin America. Some of them were immigrants. I mean, like, they were priests who came to Latin America, some of them from Spain, like Ignacio Ellacuría, who became a citizen of El Salvador, where he died. He was murdered. And he was Basque originally, from Spain. And so I do think he would have acknowledged a very important difference in terms of the racial or ethnic factor between him and many Salvadorans, of course. So, but yeah, Cone. I mean, I don't want to go down this rabbit hole necessarily, but Cone, he talked about ontological blackness, which is the idea that people who are conscientious and who dedicate themselves to the cause of the oppressed that will change their ontology, and they will become ontologically black. And I can imagine that with the protests in 2020 and the Great Awakening, as the Reeds call it, I can imagine they'd be suspicious of these, of white people from Brooklyn feeling they have acquired ontological blackness by.
How many white people from Brooklyn do you think are actually reading James Cone, though?
Yeah, very.
I think the broader question is like, sure. We're here to talk about liberation theology. I said in the intro I didn't really want to, split hairs on James Cone if you really want to go down that
Oh,
road.
sorry.
I think that was Doug Lane. If you have a problem with him, you take that out with him. I'm Jason,
Yes.
not him. So
All right.
don't argue with me because just don't want to. Why liberation theology and why now?
Well, I think that it's been urgent for a long time. I think it should have been. I mean, the left should have taken up the discussion of liberation theology a long time ago. I mean, after it passed from the agenda, mostly because that movement was wiped out, especially in Central America. Although many of its major exponents did remain alive or are still alive, like Leonardo. I'm not sure if Leonardo Boff is alive, but Gustavo Gutierrez died a short time ago. But I think that because we are still in the crisis in the left, where there's the problem of hegemony, as Gramsci called it. I mean, a huge number of people are believers. They go to church. Maybe now only 47% of Americans call themselves religious, meaning that they go to institutions of organized religion. But that's also because of a crisis of faith that doesn't, or disenchantment with institutions. It doesn't mean that there aren't more believers. But of course, I'm sure it varies greatly depending on which state you go to. And I think that poorer people tend to go to church or to mosque, and their worldview is often determined by that to a large extent. I think neoliberalism also, with its destruction or its withering away of secular public spaces, has indirectly caused a religious revival. So all religious institutions are doing rather well during the crisis of neoliberalism. The religious institutions only grow because historically religious institutions are always aim to be or to erect a parallel state that offers many of the services that a robust public sector would normally provide. Gathering places, spaces for discussions, spaces for socialization, reading groups, meals, also logistical help, like many people who are in the evangelical church, when they have some kind of life crisis or issue materially, the people who they attend the church with get through that, with material or logistical support that they cannot get from the state. They cannot get from a political party, since these are no longer. We have seen the death of political parties, especially of the Communist Party. So, but at the same time, there is this prevalence of very reactionary ideologies, very reactionary religious ideologies, whether it's the evangelicalism of obviously the evangelicals, or for that matter, the perversion of Judaism of the settler movement, which is currently in power, of course, in Israel, and is dominating American foreign policy at this very instant, of course, with the genocide, or for that matter, the different Salafist religious ideas. For example, your friend Jean Balajan, I think on this show, he was discussing his article in Compact about how the Salafist Islamic government in Syria is neoliberalism, and Islamism embraced neoliberalism at some point for reasons that have less to do with what is at the core of Islam than with what is convenient for Islamists. Because when you have a lot of neoliberalism, I mean, many of the Arab and Muslim world regimes that were that were liquidated, or that were broken down by austerity or by regime changes, because many of them were not neoliberal. They were dictatorial welfare states that allowed for certain secular spaces. And so the fewer secular spaces there are, the more people will be limited to the mosque as a place of social cohesion, of coming together, whether it's a celebration, whether it's discussions on politics and society. And so, but many of these fundamentalisms that have proliferated, really flourished with the growth or the explosion of neoliberalism, because neoliberalism destroys secular public space. Nonetheless, these organized religious movements and fundamentalisms, they have tried to bury deeper and deeper the corpses of liberation theology. And there is Islamic liberation theology. There is Protestant liberation theology, such as James Cone, who just caused us some confusion. There's Catholic liberation theology. There is Jewish liberation theology, which I think died with Marshall Mayer, an American rabbi who was very active in alerting the world to what was happening in Argentina, because he had visited the Jewish community in Argentina during the dictatorship. There are many kinds, and all of them are very rich intellectually, whether it's James Cone or Leonardo Boff or Gutierrez, Ivan Illich, who is famous for the radical deschooling, which he began to develop in Puerto Rico or while working with the Puerto Rican communities of New York. Paulo Freire, of course, is more famous for his educational ideas, which are similar than Illich, to Illich's, but they go much further. They became a whole system, very developed in Brazil. And I think that because, also the left is often dependent on churches, like whenever you have a protest about anti-war issues, it always makes the crowd more diverse and robust when there are churches who show up. It's very good to work with churches on issues like Iraq and Palestine. Also, when it comes to something like the Trump-Rubio immigration plan, during the first Trump administration.
Yeah, the woman hid out in a church for months.
Not only one woman, many churches were at the forefront of, they revived this very old idea of the basilicum as a place of refuge. That's a very old idea in Catholicism, like when Rome would be under attack, under invasion, or the rights to sanctuary of a foreigner, of someone pursued by the state. As soon as that person enters a church, there's the idea that that person has a certain right to sanctuary.
Well, what do you think liberation theology offers that the current left analysis lacks?
Well, many things. First of all, there's liberation theology. It's not about fiery preachers. It has a relationship with philosophy,
Mhm.
and it's about bringing philosophy to the people. Liberation theology also, with Gutierrez, for example, he placed great emphasis that liberation theology has a preferential. It has this preference for the poor. It chooses to side with the poor, but not necessarily because the poor are inherently good. So there's not this kind of exaltation of marginalized people as being innately great or evangelic, because liberation theology distinguishes this preference for the poor or this love of the poor from this other concept, which is the love of poverty. So people who take a vow of poverty, it's not about glorifying poverty, but rather the church decides to do away with its fatalistic past and decides that the extreme poverty that Gutierrez saw in Latin America, but also in other parts of the world, and today you definitely see it in the US, this extreme poverty is not something noble or ennobling. It is structural sin. They call it. It is evil. It is intolerable, and it is not necessary. And so the prioritization by liberation theology of the condition of the most oppressed and the poorest is because of the belief that their condition can be solved, and it should be solved because it's of moral urgency that there is a society without these forms of socioeconomic misery. And liberation theology, it emphasizes dialogue. It criticizes it's more of a focus on the deed rather than the doer.
Well, let me ask you this.
Yes.
How do you see liberation theology as different from traditional religious dogma or charity-based faith work? Is it inherently subversive, in your opinion? Because
Yes.
you're in Latin America right now, right? Are you allowed to say where you are? Are you hiding state?
No, I'm on the island where I was born.
Okay. So you're Aruba?
Yeah. Well, Aruba is like 30 kilometers off the coast of Venezuela.
I mean, you still can't swim there.
Huh?
I said you still can't swim there.
No.
Did you take a chopper?
Chopper to Venezuela?
Yeah. How do you get
there used to be a ferry to Venezuela. There used to be a ferry.
Chopper? It sucks. You can't get in the chopper.
But I'm sure the DEA flies over here in a chopper.
They're in the choppers. But all jokes aside, Venezuela is across the water from you. Yes. There is some serious poverty in Venezuela.
Absolutely.
How involved is the church at this point? Because there is a massive difference between charity and what we're talking about, which is a little more a deeper understanding of the relationship between, what is just, right? When like him or not, and I don't agree with everything Cohen says. he makes a certain statement about justice in that book, Crossing the Lynching Tree. And there's a massive chasm between that type of dialogue and what you get from. I was just recently in San Francisco for my daughter's college graduation, and I was staying, unbeknownst to myself, a Bay Area native who has forgotten where anything is. I was staying near a massive church called Glide Memorial that does a lot of outreach with the unhoused in San Francisco. So it was just, blocks and blocks of people living on the street in this place that, can give refuge to a small handful of people, but it is just charity.
Yeah. Well, like a typical liberation theologian type of priest will then say there is the long and the short way of love, or something like that. The short way is through acts of charity, and the long way is a more revolutionary process. And typically, in this ideology, there is a belief that there has to be a very fundamental transformation of the socioeconomic order, and Leonardo Boff, he in the book that got him banned, basically, he was Ratzinger condemned him to years of silence, told him he has to live out a sentence of at least a year of silence or more over that book, which he was sentenced in 1985 by Ratzinger, who later became Pope. But Leonardo Boff distinguishes three different types of church in Latin America. So there's the church which is already dying by then, which is a church that is completely fixated on the other world and the beyond, and the church being a purely spiritual place that has no contact with this world. And then there's the second type of church, which by then is more common in Latin America, which is a church that tries to have some connection with the people, and therefore tries to educate the children of the upper and middle classes, to tell them that they have to help the poor, but they still remain apolitical. And he says that kind of church he has a very interesting philosophical way of categorizing these three. So there's the, he calls it the kingdom, the church, and the world. So the church is supposed to be at best a mediator between the kingdom, which is this utopian vision, and the world, which is the world as it is. And so, but in this categorization, or this distinction that Boff makes, this kind of church encouraged the children of the bourgeoisie to be good people and to help the poor, to not get involved in politics. According to him, even though that kind of church did lead to many very idealistic groups of young people who were genuine, that kind of church failed in Latin America, because that kind of church, what they did during most authoritarian regimes was that they only intervened acting as mediators behind the scenes. So priests who wanted to do good would not condemn the regimes in public, or would not defend anyone in public, but they would act as mediators between the military and the families of people who were perhaps missing, or who were being imprisoned or persecuted, in order to set a few things right, to do some favors. But essentially, that was a church that failed the people, that failed morally. And I think the old Francis, before he became Pope, was more belonging to that kind of church that Boff criticizes. And then there's this third type of church, which is a more transformative, and that's a church that aims to be that aims to be a real conduit for the poor, and it aims to be by and for the most oppressed, who are the majority of the believers in most cases. So,
are you yourself a liberation theologian?
no, no. Although I've always been interested in liberation theology, I guess, yeah, I've always been interested in liberation theology since I was about 19 or so.
I thought you were going to say a young boy, and I was going to call bullshit, but 19, okay. What about it at 19 tickled your fancy? Are you from a very religious family?
No, not really. No, I mean, cousins who, paternal cousins who are religious, but I mean, the place where I grew up is very, very Catholic. Aruba is very Catholic, and there was almost nothing happening politically. And as a teenager, I was like the only anarchist around. And I was also, I mean, at a younger age, I was much more, I didn't like religion. I had a loathing for all forms of organized religion, but I began to read a lot more about world mythology and so on, and consistent with anarchism, I guess, I had some, although anarchists are also very, very dogmatic and anti-religious, but I had certain issues with Marxism, certain issues with particularly Stalinism and its specter in history. And so I wanted to, I was, I guess, looking for, I suppose, alternatives, although liberation theology and Marxism are somewhat compatible. And I mean, they're not alternatives to each other.
My co-host calls liberation theology Marxism for Catholics.
Right. I mean, all of them, all the liberation theologians would deny that they are Marxists. They would say that they are simply informed by the social sciences. They won't say that they're Marxists anymore. How that's Weberians, or I don't know, but it's compatible for sure. But they tried very hard to fight this image, this idea that liberation theology is just a priest blessing the revolution or something, or a priest blessing the AK-47 of the guerrilla, and it tries to go much deeper than that. Though they do reach some of the same conclusions, because the philosophers that these thinkers stress are important are the ones who looked at nature, who looked at the natural world, who looked at the physical world. And so they say you have to look out at the.
Don't read So, you were saying you have to look out into the world. You were saying.
So like for Ignacio Ellacuría, the guy in El Salvador, he talked a lot about some pre-Socratic Greek philosophers who would emphasize looking at nature and emphasize that human nature is one that tries to manipulate to give shape to our world. So they try to do away with the fatalism that has typified much of Christianity in the past, but they still hold on to the religious experience. And so I guess that as an artist attracted me, because I never found it cool to rubbish the religious experience or to rubbish religious people. And that interested me, and also some doubts I had about Marxism, but particularly the Marxism that has been informed historically or malformed by Stalinism. I wanted to see, because liberation theology is obviously something that's really not compatible with Stalinist
Nope.
attitude towards religion.
Not at all. You write in your piece about Pope Francis, because you are kind of responding to an article that was in Compact magazine.
Yeah.
What was it about that magazine, that article? You don't have to get into the magazine, that kind of ticked you off. I know you didn't like the way they presented Francis as a neoliberal.
Yeah,
Which I didn't agree with either.
Yeah, this dude, Nathan Pinkowski, who he's a Compact columnist, and so he's in this. Compact is, I know some of the editors, and I contributed in the past to Compact, an article about Argentina and about the culture wars. Anyway, but Compact floats upon this pool of, thinkers who have decided that the new way to be subversive in the West today is to declare yourself heterodox Catholic. And so most of the people in Compact have some kind of connection to people who are flirting with forms of heterodox Catholicism. Like the first time I encountered some of them, I was taking an online course on Ivan Illich.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and but I could tell that they were trying to get into heterodox Catholicism, and I found it just very surprising that for the past few years of Compact's existence, they barely engage with Pope Francis. They don't mention him, or they barely mention him in passing. And then after his death, there's this article which does something that, because Compact is, it's part of the vanguard, the new vanguard of anti-woke publications, and so, but they do something that you will normally find, in the woke industry, which is that whatever you dislike, you characterize it as inherently neoliberal, and you use neoliberal as the adjective. And so the fact that they were relatively silent on Francis for such a long time, and that people who identify as heterodox Catholic, they didn't ever publish anything on liberation theology either, maybe because they have a cliche idea of what that is. Maybe they think liberation, I don't know, maybe they associate it with hippies or something.
Do you think that liberation theology, sorry to kind of cut you off, but do you think it's just been gone for so long? Because I don't really hear too many people in left circles talk about it. Maybe the dirty wars are over. Most of the people that were a part of that movement are gone.
Yeah, well, they're not all. No, they're not gone. All of them. Well, Latin America has faded from the agenda in general. The U.S. cultural establishment has not paid any attention to Latin America, just as the American political establishment has not paid much attention to it. Like, I think Obama had one tour of Latin America in this second administration, and then Biden, he organized this bizarre conference where half the continent was not there. He disinvited Venezuela and
just one of the American client states he didn't want to deal with.
Yeah, just a few. Yeah, Bukele. Latin America has really fallen from the agenda and fallen out of fashion. And I'm not sure why that is, other than, of course, the focus of the war on terror. Brought the world's attention to the Middle East. I can't really tell why is it, because you think, right, that with 30 million Latino immigrants in the U.S., how many Latinos are there in the U.S.? Approximately 30 million or more. You'd think it would be kind of hip, right, to talk about Latin America, but it's not. It's like a place that people try to relegate to oblivion somehow. But the liberation theology is still around, just not in the left. So, of course, Francis was largely seen as a reconciliation with liberation theology. Many of the priests who had been cast as troublemakers or who had been almost banned were suddenly welcome again to meet with Francis. He asked for their forgiveness for the way they had been treated, and he tried to apply some of their principles even. And Paulo Freire is still very influential. Leonardo Boff is, I think he's, no, he's, I'm sorry, but Leonardo Boff is still somewhat influential, or at least his books are read. Not very much. One form of liberation theology that I think is very interesting, has been forgotten, but might be very interesting to bring back, is the Islamic liberation theologian Ali Shariati, who was very, very radical for his time. He was part of the Iranian Revolution, but he may very likely have been assassinated by agents of the Iranian state later on. And he had a book on women, for example, called Fatima is Fatima, where he argues that the hijab, the veil on woman is something of the past, that it's not necessary for a Muslim woman to wear the veil to be a believer. And he has some very, very poetic and very interesting works that I knew I have a young friend. Well, he's not that much younger than me, but he's in. He's a Palestinian guy, exile, who is into reading Shariati. So it's not completely dead, but indeed it would require, and I would like to advocate for a revival of liberation theology, a revival mostly in the form of publishing or printing or translating works of liberation theology into English, from Spanish or from other languages, into Arabic, into other languages. I would really I would like to advocate for that.
Well, can the institutional church really be a vehicle for liberation today, or is it too compromised?
It depends. I don't find the institutional church, if you mean the Catholic Church, I don't find it too compromised, because the Catholic Church has always allowed for some form of, with the exception of the Inquisition, of course, has allowed for some forms of spontaneity and for some forms of subversion, because they've tried to remain organic. The Catholic Church has understood how to stay alive and afloat as a very political institution for thousands of years, by not denying too much of what the people want in a heartfelt way. So that's why there are so many saints, because every very important pre-Christian character or pre-Christian pagan god, or every piece of folklore that was very dear to people, the church decided, well, if we do away with this, if we ban this, the people will rebel against us. So we have to somehow incorporate it and call it a saint or call it Catholic when we know it's not. And that's the whole history of the Catholic Church. So the Catholic Church, I'm not saying it's not hierarchical, but or that it's especially democratic. There are many movements to democratize it from within, but I think that the Catholic Church has tried to remain organic, and therefore it never became an airtight space where no resistance is allowed, because if they try to wipe out any alternative cultures or any popular religion or any popular movement within the church, they'll cease to exist. They'll become too static and they'll just break. They've always understood that balancing act. And the current Pope, he is, I don't know that much about him, but he spent a long time in Peru. He definitely was close to Gutierrez. He definitely has these ideas of preference for the poor, probably more consistently than Francisco did during his life. So I do see that, the church as a potential ally for political mobilization of left-wing issues and social issues, if the left is willing to be more tolerant of differences of opinion when it comes to social, cultural, moral issues and abortion and so on. But as an ally for anti-war, as an ally for workers' rights, as an ally
carceral struggles,
carceral, prison, better wages, health care, immigration for sure. So on all of these issues, I think the church could be an ally and a space for discussion. I don't mean the church as in, all these deacons and all these people, but rather people who are in church. I don't mean the church as in its hierarchy, but part of the church. And I do think that also there has to be a counter culture that pushes against evangelical evangelization, because the evangelical church is an extremist movement that is very successful and that keeps growing and growing, and is much more authoritarian in its structures, and has this prosperity gospel, which is basically like some kind of Las Vegas version of the American dream that it propagates around the world, and of course fanatically devoted to whatever Netanyahu is trying to do. And so the evangelical church keeps expanding, and simply rubbishing religious people or insulting them or telling them that what they believe is nonsense is not going to stop the growth of the evangelical church. And also, and Islam is not going away. I'm not saying the left should get involved in Islam, but rather it should make the ideas that were suppressed, it should make them available, because the Islamism that keeps growing in the world is the Islamism that has embraced neoliberalism. And so,
we're going to ask you this. Can liberation theology help bridge gaps between racial justice movements and class-based labor struggles, or is that too much to ask of a theological framework?
No, I don't think so, because liberation theology, first of all, it prioritizes the condition of the very oppressed, as it prioritizes socioeconomic misery as something that is no longer tolerable under the banner of fatalism. And so, of course, socioeconomic misery is definitely multiracial. It's multiracial in the United States. It's multiracial in Colombia, where you have many, there are, white people and black people in slums. In Argentina, it's multiracial. In Brazil, a race is much more, the connection between race and poverty can be more blatant in the north of Brazil, but still, I think liberation theology, it can bridge gaps, definitely, because it prioritizes socioeconomic misery as over race. However, well, James Cone, who I think is very interesting, and I really found the passage you read beautiful in the beginning, but James Cone, in particular, he's Protestant, and he can be misinterpreted as another critical race theorist, even though I think he was much more sincere than the average critical race
I think
theory.
he comes out of that time, right? You're also
Yeah.
talking about the 60s and 70s, so it is a time where a lot of people are kind of entrenched in nationalism,
Yes.
especially Black nationalism. So I get that.
Yeah. There's also something about the culture wars, the divisiveness of the culture wars in the US that has a very Protestant quality to it. And,
They're hardworking.
well,
They're so
they're
hardworking in their culture war.
No, yeah, that too, but their whole idea of compensation, their obsession with compensation, and their attempts to mimic the oppressed. This is something like, there are many aspects to the whole culture war problem that seem like they're part of the cultural and baggage of Protestantism in the U.S., of puritanical Protestantism. And I think that is one obstacle for in the North Atlantic societies and in the U.S. The fact that Protestant morality is a cause of a lot of problems in these cultural wars. And yeah.
In your piece, you call out the way right-wing populists like those at Compact misdiagnose neoliberalism, blaming immigrants instead of CEOs. Why is this framing so seductive to some people on the right and parts of the left?
Well, I guess it's not surprising that it's seductive on the right, and it leads to a dangerous place. I mean, I think the reason why anti-Semitism, one of the reasons why anti-Semitism was so virulent was because Jews were, in the 19th century, it was still part of collective, people were still, how do you say, they remembered that Jews had been immigrants a very short time ago, and in most countries Jews were seen as immigrants because they had just immigrated, and so there was this connection made between the wandering Jew and capital and some form of phantasmagoria. Well, it's not surprising that it's popular on the right to see immigrants as, agents of chaos. But it's becoming popular on the left because of, I suppose, having given up. Although, well, many labor parties in Europe also came to the forefront of anti-immigrant politics and began to build deportation centers. And I guess it's some kind of vulgarized form of solidarity. So labor movements suddenly realize that people feel abandoned by the left. And so they say, well, let's start to listen to the workers. What are the workers saying? oh, well, the workers are saying they don't like the foreigners. Well, then, maybe liking foreigners is a luxury belief. So let's support deportations and harsh crackdowns on immigration, and let's pretend that unusual forms of violence along the borders or on the Mediterranean, or Dr. Phil joining ICE raids, that this is all part of what the people want, and therefore, it's normal. And this is part of being at peace with the working class, is to indulge these impulses and hatreds. But I think that's like a kind of vulgar Marxism, or a vulgarized solidarity, because you're not looking at things like false consciousness, of course, and at where these hatreds come from, or why is this seen as part of common sense to blame the immigrant and not the CEO when the CEO depresses the wages of workers because there is cheap immigrant labor available. Like, why is that? The notion that someone from El Salvador is to blame for that rather than the person who decided to lower the wages. Why is that common sense? And I think the duty of the left is to ask, why does this form part of the people's common sense? How do we get people to see the other side? How do we talk to them about the immigrants, that they see what they have in common with immigrants? That is more, I think, the educational task of radicals and of the left. And I guess that's implies a certain kind of time and effort that people might doubt they're capable of. You have to have spaces where you talk to people in order to explain to them that mass migration, is being caused by economic policies that are affecting all of us. Yeah. And I guess they don't believe themselves capable of creating these spaces anymore, or they've given up, and or they've maybe they've been a little bit seduced by Trump's aura of populism, and Trump's claims of being anti-war, and Trump's claims of being against neoliberalism, which is, it is subversive in a way. Trump is subversive, and to support Trump is a bit subversive, but I don't think in the long run. But I think it's defeatism on the left. Defeatism.
Well, Arturo, we're coming up on the hour. What else are you working on that we should be on the lookout for?
What else? Well, in terms of politics,
anything.
Anything. I don't have anything.
I didn't know that was going to be a stump question.
I'm sorry, I'm a bit out of it. I'm translating. I'm writing fiction and poetry, and translating myself into English. I don't have any book with a publisher in the pipeline. Of course, I have many essays on culture that I keep producing and that I would like to bring out as a book, of course. But I can't say, look for this title with a certain publisher right now. It's not as exciting as that at the moment. I am going to a poetry festival in El Salvador. I have been invited to.
Well, you be careful. And you keep all your political opinions in here and don't let them out here, because that's
Yeah.
going to get you in there.
They're
And-
probably gonna see this video.
oh, they won't see this video. They
No.
won't see it because we love El Salvador here. Beautiful country.
The algorithm will hide it. The
Beautiful
algorithm.
country. Arturo
Yeah.
is a hardcore Nazi, and he wants to lock everybody up. So please leave him alone. With LA fans.
Look,
You're
I
less than
have
four
this
people earlier.
tattoo from when I was 15.
There you go.
Yeah.
Your tattoo says "Yay Hitler." There you go. So
Yes.
just leave him alone.
Yes. Yeah. Hitler. Tren de Aragua.
Your Trinidad.
Choo-choo train. Aragua choo-choo train.
You joke now, and the next thing you know, they shaved your head, and you're next to a guy with a whole face tattoo.
Yes.
And you're going to learn a totally definition of tossing the salad. It's not going to be fun.
That's the only reason why I behave at all well. The fear of prison. So
they do not seem fun. Here, there's a question that Antoine says, please ask him if there is still active liberation theologists active in the South. I guess he means South America.
Yes, there are many in Brazil, especially in Peru, of course. The name of the poetry festival is called Amada Libertad.
Yeah, that sounds like a fucking trap. Yeah. We'll just get them all in one place. They're that dumb. No shit.
Yes, it's a self-deportation. Yeah.
I love this that Drea sent you this message like a concerned mom. She needs you to text her when you get home.
Okay.
Yeah, just tweet when you get home so we know you're okay.
Well, in El Salvador, they do have a convincing illusion of security these days. With this guy who puts his cap on backwards, Nayib, crypto Nayib.
Well, thank you very much, Arturo. You have a very good rest of your evening and stay safe. And definitely message me when you get back from El Salvador so I know that you are not in prison.
I'll send a selfie.
Yes, send a selfie. Got to make sure it's not AI. That is Arturo Desimone. Wherever you are watching or listening to this show, there's a link in the description that leads you to Arturo's article in Counterpunch. And he's been on the show like 3 or 4 times. So go back and watch some of the other appearances of Arturo. I think they're evergreen. That being said, I'll be going to the champagne room with M. Toussaint, the faceless voice of reason here on TIR. She wants to talk to you guys about the Puffy trial. She does. Actually, we both do. We both have some deep dives to make on the Puffy trial. I am a little worried about Arturo going to El Salvador for a poetry conference just because Coach Lick said it's a trap. It does seem like it, but stranger things have happened. But one of the guests on this show was imprisoned recently for saying something against their government. For words. Just words. The power of words. So, if you'd like to join me in the champagne room, there's only one way. Become a patron for as little as $3 a month or $30 for the year. You can access all these champagne rooms. If you were on the fence about it, you don't know. That's fine, because there's a free trial offer. So, wherever you're watching or listening to this show, there's a link for the Patreon in the description. Patreon.com/BitterLakePresents. If you haven't done it already, please like, please subscribe, hit the bell. I'll see you guys Saturday for the star-studded chocolatey cast. I think we will have every hue of black person. We are out. Not that out. This out.